Waiting for everyone to sign in. They're coming in fast. I wanted to remind you, if you haven't used the Zoom platform before, that there's a question and answer function at the bottom of your browser. There's also a chat box. The question and answers, if you ask the questions in there, we can respond as panelists to those questions when we're done with our presentation. We're going to get going in a few minutes here, and thank you for spending some time with us on your lovely Tuesday afternoon at 1 o'clock Eastern on the East Coast Standard Time. So it's 1 o'clock. I'd like to introduce everyone to the AWAKE Sleep Apnea Initiative, first ever national AWAKE meeting that the American Sleep Apnea Association is going to be putting on June 8th in College Park, Maryland. It's an externally led, patient-focused, what was a drug development meeting and has now been evolved into a patient-focused medical product development meeting. And I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed colleague, Kim McCleary, from the KIF Collective, who has been instrumental in helping us get to this point as an organization and as a cohort to where we can finally have a national AWAKE meeting about patient journeys and how we deal with sleep apnea, both the successes, the failures, and everything else in between. I like to say the good, bad, and the ugly. Looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Can you still hear us, Michelle? We'll give you a second to respond. But with that being said, sorry for the distraction. I'm going to introduce Kim and let her introduce herself, and then I'll sort of set up the beginning of the presentation, and we'll go from there. How's that?
Sounds great, Adam. Thanks for the intro, and thanks to everybody for, as Adam said, taking time out of your Tuesday to learn more about the AWAKE Sleep Apnea Initiative and the meeting coming up on June 8th, and most importantly, ways that you can participate and be a part of this landmark initiative to shape treatment and care, better treatment and care for people living with sleep apnea. So it's been really a tremendous opportunity to work with the sleep apnea community and ASAA in particular in getting to this point where we're excited to share the details of what this meeting is, what it's all about, and how it will, how the information that we collect over the next several weeks will be used by regulators, by life science industry partners, by the organization, and hopefully by care providers to improve outcomes that people with sleep apnea have in better managing their health. I have been involved in this work for, gosh, more than 25 years at this point, and have been involved with the patient-focused drug development initiative that's been happening with the FDA since it first got started back in 2012. And we'll walk through a little bit of that history just so everybody has that context. But it's been great to work with Adam and the whole ASAA team to get ready for this particular meeting, because it is a first of its kind, and I think will be remarkable in many ways. So with that, Adam, I'll turn it back over to you and tell us a little bit about ASAA.
Sean, if you could advance the slide, that would be great. So, as some of you may know, and as some of you may not, the ASA has been around a long time, the American Sleep Apnea Association. Some think we're a trade association. Up until about 5 years ago, we were run by our healthcare professionals, and there were very few patients ever in the room or who could physically even attend a meeting because of health issues. And we've sort of evolved in the last 5 years to become patient-governed, patient-led, and self-patient funded when and where we can get funds to support the projects that matter to us. One of our key programs, thanks to the donations of individual donors throughout the country, but also some of the device manufacturers, is our CPAP assistance program, which we've placed over 5,000 machines into patients' hands in the last couple of years, including in times of emergency disaster, and FEMA and Red Cross have used our program, and it's been a vital resource to a lot of patients out there that are either underinsured or have high premium deductibles or just can't even figure out how to get get a machine, but they have a prescription and they're not being treated. One of our other major campaigns is the annual Sleeptember campaign, which is the month of September, where we draw awareness to sleep and to all our existing partners and how sleep plays a role in each and every one of our lives, not just for sleep apnea, but for how it affects us in the workplace, how it affects us at school, and in our everyday lives. And one of our oldest existing programs is our AWAKE network, which has been traditionally local regional support groups that were run out of sleep clinics and doctor offices. And for those of you who don't know what the AWAKE acronym stands for, it's Alert, Well, and Keeping Energetic, which is very pertinent to why we are doing this AWAKE Sleep Apnea initiative, in that most sleep apnea patients are tired, they're chronically fatigued, they have excessive daytime sleepiness, even if they are getting full treatment on whatever modality or intervention they're using. So we thought it was incumbent upon us to really wake up the world to being alert, well, and keeping energetic. I like to say I don't know what I only knew what good sleep was is when I found out what bad sleep was. Before that, and I didn't articulate that well, my baseline was normal. It wasn't until I had a mask on that I actually knew what it was to sleep. And with that, so we have our AWAKE Sleep Apnea Network, which has been traditionally brick and mortar, and we now have a virtual support group on our Facebook group. And this meeting come June 8th will be our first live broadcast of a national AWAKE meeting. And we invite you all to come and participate as well. Currently, we have a couple of different projects going on with Dr. Carl Stepnowski, who's our Chief Science Officer at the UC San Diego and the Veterans Affairs. One of them being the PCORnet demonstration project with the COPD Foundation. We're looking at an intervention to help patients who both have COPD and OSA improve their adherence and their quality of life outcomes as a result of the intervention that we are introducing to them. And then for the last 2 years, we've had an ongoing observational sleep health study on the Apple iTunes store that's free to anyone who wants to go and download it. And we are working on the next versions coming out as well as the Android version. And with all this work that we've been doing in the last 5 years, it's really given us an opportunity for the regulators, for the rest of the key stakeholders inside the sleep field and in the healthcare field to realize that it's time that we heard from the OSA patients directly about all our journeys for the 10, 20 years before diagnosis, up to diagnosis, and all the way through. Sean, if you want to move the next slide, that'll sort of inform us to where we're getting, and then I'll let Kim take it from here.
Great, thanks, Adam. So if you think about this slide kind of depicts the journey of a new medicine as it's discovered in the lab and then brought into the development process, comes before the Food and Drug Administration at several points along that long what can be 10 to 20 year path toward coming to market. If you think about that whole journey that is long and expensive, up until very recently, there have been relatively few opportunities for patients to participate in that process. And the opportunities that they have traditionally had have been fairly limited and mostly reactive. You know, many patient organizations will mobilize their communities, they'll advocate for more research, they'll fundraise to donate money to particular scientists studying their condition, and they'll inform both the public and the patient community about all of those activities and ways to connect with one another. That's been kind of the most, I think, traditional role for patient advocacy organizations. A little more recently, as new drug therapies were being studied and under development by pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, sometimes when those clinical trials might hit a roadblock, either in terms of recruitment or keeping people in clinical trials, the company would turn to the patient advocacy organizations and ask for their help to help recruit or retain patients in those clinical trials. So patient groups as rescue challenging clinical studies, if you think of it that way. And then kind of the third opportunity that has been around at least since the days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic is the FDA's inclusion of a single patient representative on advisory committees that help the FDA to make decisions about whether or not a particular therapy is ready for market, whether the benefits of that therapy outweigh the risks and potential harms to the patients who it would be intended to be used. And in the early 90s, they started including a single patient representative. But as you can see from this depiction, that was at the end of a very long and again, expensive process. And the patient, have a single individual having a voice at that late stage probably couldn't do much to influence whether that therapy was even hitting on the right things that the patient cared about, or whether the profile of the benefits was in line with something that they thought they would need. So it was, again, a fairly limited and mostly reactive way for patients to participate. Sean, if you could switch to the next slide. And it also, kind of speaks to the fact that when the FDA, who again is the authority that has to approve a new therapy, whether it's a medical device like your CPAP machine or a new drug therapy, is coming to market, they had a whole lot of things they were focused on in looking at all the evidence that had been accumulated over that long period of time. And what the patient's view was on that medicine was just kind of one of a whole myriad of things that they were weighing. And it didn't have much prominence, actually, until very recently in the mind of the FDA regulator. So, Sean, you can go to the next slide, please. And what it all kind of boils down to when the FDA gets all of that evidence and they have to decide whether the benefits outweigh the risks, it's kind of like this slide. And I borrowed this from a colleague, Tarek Hamed at Merck. Adam, even if you and I looked at this slide together, you might think that looks like a great way to spend your vacation, cycling along those cliffs. And I might say, no way, no how, or we could potentially, reverse those roles. But it really comes down to kind of a very personal assessment of whether that looks thrilling or perilous. And you can almost imagine the same thing as you undertake a new medical therapy. Let's move to the next slide. It's not that different a thing. We make these kind of benefit-risk decisions every day, all day in our lives. Some of us will cross a crosswalk only when the walk signal comes on, and somebody else might say, well, the walk signal doesn't have to be on, but if there aren't any cars coming, I'm going to go ahead. And then we've probably all got somebody in our lives who will dodge the cars as they're coming at them, even though the walk signal is not on. And it's kind of that way in pursuing medical therapies as well. Many of us who are Matthew McConaughey fans will recognize the Dallas Buyers Club image down there, a movie that came out a couple years ago depicting the scenario when HIV/AIDS activists really kind of took things in their own hands when the FDA was really fairly slow in terms of its review of new AIDS-related therapies coming through the pipeline. And they knew that there were things that could potentially extend their lives or make their suffering somewhat less. And you had these buyers clubs where the kind of risk benefits were assessed by the individual rather than the other players in the system. Now that's an extreme example, but it's not that out of line with what really happens. And I've got just two examples shown here where the FDA determined that Avastin was, no longer kind of meeting that correct threshold from their standpoint, that the benefits were not outweighed by the risks. in using Avastin to treat a particular type of breast cancer. And in the case of MS, a drug called Lemtrada initially did not seem to meet that benefit risk profile. And you might think, you know, what does all of this have to do with me? And if we look at the next slide, you can see again that the way the system has traditionally been set up is FDA sort of takes all of the evidence from a particular manufacturer, whether it's for a drug or a medical device, and evaluates in a very, you know, socially focused way what the benefits and risks for the entire population of people who might use that medical product would be. And that dictates whether that product is available on the market or not. And then you have your healthcare provider who takes all of the things that are available on the market and has to assess kind of for the benefit of her or his patient, whether the benefits and the risks might weigh out, how they might weigh out in a particular circumstance. And they will either write a prescription for one product or another, depending on how they assess those benefits and risks, knowing what the patient's own kind of health history and intentions are. And then finally, you get to the point of the patient who has to assess whether the prescriptions that the doctor has written really kind of fit with what is going on in their life in terms of the benefits and the risks, and is this medicine really going to, you know, change the symptoms that I'm experiencing? Am I going to have to deal with side effects that might make it hard for me to do my job or, you know, be available to my family or pursue my education? And you have to make those decisions kind of at the end of this long chain of a medicine being developed, it being approved by the FDA, kind of going through your provider's hands, and then finally the choice is yours. Well, you might imagine that in kind of an era and a culture where we are more and more expecting that we are going to be participating in all kinds of decisions in a very democratic, with a little d, not to make a political statement, but we all have more access to information. We expect to have more influence over things that are going on in our lives, and this is certainly no different. And this kind of traditional hierarchy gets us to the point where the regulator, the FDA official, and the patient, who is kind of the end user of all of these medical enhancements and innovations, might agree on the facts about whether something, what the benefits are and what the potential risks and harms are, but they might have very different views on the value, both in terms of the benefits and how much difference those would make in the life of a patient, and also how much they're willing to tolerate in terms of risks and harms to achieve a certain benefit of medicines. Sean, if you want to go on. So, as I said, with kind of this new societal and cultural era that we are in, where there's much more emphasis on the individual, much more kind of expectation of things being tailor-made. Even if you think about coffee, I mean, we used to all be happy with Taster's Choice, those freeze-dried crystals coming out of a bottle that weren't particularly, you know, they all tasted the same and made a pretty decent cup of coffee that was, you could expect it would taste the same day after day. You know, now we walk into a Starbucks and we want a triple mocha latte, whipped, skim, light, whatever. I'm not a coffee drinker. So, and it's got to have our name on it. We've gotten as a culture to expect that something is going to reflect our own values. And so here we are in the dawn of a new time with regard to how a lot of these decisions about not only what prescriptions we end up with in our hands at the end of a doctor's visit, but actually what the products are that are going through that long process of being developed. Sean, if you go to the next slide, please. In 2012, there was a piece of legislation called the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act that was the result of actually many years of advocacy at the federal level by a number of different patient organizations that really had been pushing since the days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the real height of that crisis, to have more influence over regulatory decisions, to have more input into the processes that went into the research and development of new medical therapies. And there's kind of this landmark piece of legislation that passed in 2012 that created two things. First, it created something called the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative, and it also created this structured benefit risk framework. And we won't go into the second one too much, but if you think back to the days in the classroom when you were learning long division, and if you're like my husband, you can do that in your head, and once you learned how to do it, but your teacher always wanted you to show your work. You know, even if you could get to the right answer without writing anything down, you had to show your work, and sometimes you wouldn't get credit unless you showed your work. Well, the
story of my life.
The structured benefit risk framework is a little bit like FDA being asked to show its work. When it came down and weighed those benefits and those risks, and they looked at all of the evidence, the people making those medicines wanted to have a better idea of how they got to the answer, to see how all of that evidence weighed out. So they came up with this new approach called the structured benefit risk framework. And they created kind of an open space for patient perspectives to inform part of that work that they were going to show. And again, we won't spend too much time on that, but it was an important opportunity that shapes what we're going to be doing on June 8th. Next slide, please. And so this Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act kind of led two of the centers within the FDA to take somewhat parallel but complementary approaches to how they were going to get that patient information to put into the benefit risk framework. The Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where new medicines that we kind of take everything from allergy medicine that you might take on during this season of the year, all the way to, you know, cancer chemotherapies are studied and evaluated, took this tact of the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative and a series of meetings. And they also started to do some patient-led guidances where communities of patients working with their academic partners and industry partners would start to shape what are called regulatory guidances to stimulate industry investment in their specific disease area. So those were two things that they took on. On kind of the other side of the campus, the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, where everything from tongue depressors to microwave ovens to pet food, it's incredible the number of things that the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health undertakes, also including things like CPAP and oral appliances in sleep apnea. They took a slightly different tact and actually made patient engagement one of their top 3 strategic priorities for the years 2016 and 2017. And they also undertook something called the Patient Preference Initiative to help understand when there is a sort of preference-sensitive decision, how do people make decisions about benefits and risks? So on to the next slide, please. And this is just a little bit more detail on what the Devices Center did. They actually, their director, Dr. Jeffrey Shuren, set a goal that by the end of 2017, 90% of CDRH employees would interact with patients as part of their jobs. They had a number of other very specific goals that they set. They took on a partnership with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium to understand preference-sensitive decisions and decision-making around preferences, and went a very kind of scientific route on that work. Next slide. And then the Drug Center for Drug Evaluation, did these meetings, the patient-focused drug development meetings. And they really kind of created a venue for patients to come directly speak with the FDA about the symptoms and daily impacts of their disease, the treatments and other approaches they're using. And they were very inclusive in terms of understanding that it's not just medicines. There are a lot of things that people use to try to relieve symptoms and function more fully and live better with their diseases, like prayer and yoga and complementary therapies, vitamins, over-the-counter things. And they wanted to really understand how well the available therapies were meeting their needs and what future therapies should address. Like, is there a symptom that's not really well dealt with by the medicines that are available, if there are any? And then they tried to attract patients and caregivers, people who live with and support patients who reflect kind of the whole range of patient journeys and experience. And this was a big shift, because if you think about that diagram that I showed at the very beginning with that single patient sitting on the advisory committee, you had in those days kind of a real emphasis on the poster child, if you will, kind of the single patient who would be recognizable to authority figures, whether it was members of Congress or the scientific community, as being kind of the patient advocate, if you will. And this was a very different approach, where they really wanted to hear from as wide a cross-section of the community as they could. In 2017, when this initial program sort of wrapped up, they moved those meetings. They really liked those meetings, but they recognized that FDA alone could not convene meetings on 10,000 diseases. So they created an opportunity for patient organizations to become the host for those meetings. And there's an application process, and you do it in a very collaborative fashion, but they kind of shifted the opportunity from the FDA to the external community. And so far to date, they have held about 40 of those meetings through a combination of the ones hosted by FDA and now ones that are being hosted by patient organizations. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the real meat of the webinar today, is the opportunity that the American Sleep Apnea Association seized on to be part of this movement of patient perspectives and patient journeys and patient needs, really shaping what the FDA understands about what it's like to live with sleep apnea, what the FDA and life science partners understand about the unmet medical needs that people living with sleep apnea and caring for people with sleep apnea have, and what's important to them as new products move through the development pipeline. So we're really excited to announce that ASAA was approved for one of these meetings in February. We've spent the last several weeks kind of ramping up and getting ready for the announcement that was made a couple of weeks ago about the June 8th meeting, and getting mobilizing a number of partners to help us with this. So the really exciting thing about this is, because the nature of sleep apnea is such that the management of the condition really involves a combination of medical devices, primarily the CPAP therapy and BiPAP and APAP therapies, as well as oral appliances. And many people take supportive medications either primarily for their sleep apnea or for the comorbid conditions that are very frequently kind of part of that individual's overall health picture. We have been successful in enlisting participation from both centers that review drugs and the center that reviews medical devices. And this will be the first meeting billed as a patient-focused medical product development meeting. And that makes it kind of unique and a great opportunity for the sleep apnea community to lead others by example. As Adam said at the top of the hour, this will be held on June 8th, Friday, June 8th. in the Washington, D.C. area at the College Park Marriott, which is proximate to the FDA and helps to ensure that they will be present in large numbers. And it also immediately follows the big sleep scientific meeting that's happening in Baltimore earlier that week. So we're hoping for some carryover of some of the folks who will be in town for that. Now, there are a number of ways in which you can participate in this initiative, whether you're a person who lives with sleep apnea herself or himself, whether your spouse or partner or another loved one might have the condition, or you're somebody who takes care of people as a healthcare provider, dentist or physician, sleep tech, etc. We have a number of different ways. We have launched a survey, and we'll be kind of previewing some of the early results that we've gotten that I think start to help you understand why this information is of such high interest to the FDA and to medical and drug innovators.
Teresa actually put a link up. Teresa put a link up to the survey in the chat box for anybody who's interested.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Adam. On the day of the meeting, so you can go ahead and respond to that survey at any time after this webinar ends, right up until I think we'll actually keep it open a week or so after the June 8th meeting. And it takes about 15 minutes to complete. So, you know, we've asked a lot of questions, but we think the information is really important, and we'll be sharing that back after the survey closes. On June 8th, there are a few ways to participate as well. In addition to there being a very nice, comfortable ballroom at the Marriott in College Park, there will also be a live webcast, so you may have an even more comfortable place you can watch the meeting from and take full participation in. Throughout the course of the day, as the meeting goes on, we'll have the opportunity for all participants, whether they're on site or watching by webcast, to participate in real-time polling questions. And we'll be polling some of the information from the survey where there is either a lot of agreement and a little bit of kind of the tails, if you will, of data that we want to understand a little better, or places where the results are kind of all over the map and we want to understand the spread across the community in their responses. But we'll chip into that through the polling questions and then also through the discussion and dialogue that day at the meeting. And if you think of the setup as kind of being a little bit Oprah-esque, I'm getting my age away because I realize Oprah isn't on every day at 4 o'clock like she used to be. But, you know.
We need her.
Yeah, we'll be, you know, drawing on the experience and expertise of all of the patient, caregiver, and family members in the room, not just a chosen few. We're continuing on this path of getting away from the kind of poster child way that things like this in the past might have happened. And we are still seeking 8 to 10 patients and caregivers who would help kick off each of sort of 2 discussion periods with their own personal reflections about either the symptoms and the impact of the illness or the approaches to therapies. If you're interested in doing that, there is a link within the registration pathway, I think, that will direct you to kind of an expanded form of the survey that you can respond to, and we will be in touch with folks later this week who respond to that survey. Now, the question that occurs most often is, okay, this sounds great, and I think it'll be really helpful to bring patients together and have this conversation, but what happens on June 9th with the information? So how does the FDA in particular use this information from these 40 meetings they've had and surveys like the AWAKE Sleep Apnea Survey? Next slide, please. So again, the kind of drug center and the devices center take slightly different approaches because the development of those two types of medical products are slightly different and different from kind of both the way that research happens and also the way that they're regulated. But this slide is actually from the FDA, and it depicts 4 basic questions that they're asking and using the kind of information that will be generated through the survey and the June 8th meeting to answer. So they want to really understand from a patient view what the impact of the disease is, what the burden of therapy is, what are the most important things to patients about that experience. And that can help shape kind of, even in a crowded therapeutic area like, let's say, asthma, where there's a lot of different ways to treat asthma. There's a lot of asthma medicines, there are rescue inhalers, there are lifestyle adjustments. There's still a significant amount of unmet medical need. And if you're going to go into that space, you better know what the patient experience is so that you don't either duplicate something that already exists or you go after a target that nobody cares about. The second area would be how clinical trials can be better tailored to the needs of patients. And it's kind of remarkable to me that a lot of clinical trials, nobody sits down and really thinks through what the experience of a clinical trial is from the subject's point of view. And it often takes patients to point out the fact that, well, you want me to arrive at 6 a.m. and I have to go through this battery of tests, and I'm going to be sleep deprived, and you told me to fast, and I don't get to eat until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I have to do an exercise test at the end of the day, and I'm completely wiped out, so the results aren't valid. It's those kinds of things that patient perspectives can help the clinical trial designers to improve upon so that you don't lose so many patients from participating. And the next thing is this pre-market review, and it goes back again to the benefit risk. If the regulators don't really understand what's most important to patients, and they don't understand how much of a change they might need to see in order to accept the side effects or the risks of a therapy, it's hard for them to make an informed decision about whether that product is, whether the evidence supports it being available on the market. So they're really paying a lot more attention to what the patient view of benefit risk is as they make these kinds of decisions. And then the final thing is, if a medicine is approved, when they put it onto the market, and most of us probably do the same thing I do, when you go to the pharmacy and you pick up your prescription and you get that long piece of paper with microscopic print on it, you just kind of toss it out because you're not going to read it anyway. They're thinking more now about how do we label medicines, how do we communicate information about what to expect, what the side effects might be, what the benefit risk profile is, what exactly this medicine is trying to treat in a way that will be meaningful to patients and also help physicians and other prescribers to do a better job of matching up what the patient is telling them is most troublesome in their life to the available therapies that are out there. So that's the way that the Center for Drug Evaluation will use this medicine. If we go to the next slide, the way that the Medical Devices Center is using it is similar, although, you know, medical devices are a little bit more of an iterative process of design and execution, because they can make kind of technology changes and other types of changes that aren't as easy when you're talking about molecules and chemistry, to reflect kind of user-centered design principles. And you can see kind of the short statement about this slide is that there's opportunity for patient perspectives to influence every step along the way. And the FDA Center for Devices and Radiologic Health is really kind of challenging medical device manufacturers to think about the patient at each one of these steps along the way. And that's exciting news for people who rely on medical devices in the way that this community very specifically does. Next slide, please. The other thing that has come out of this whole initiative are two important guidance documents. These don't look like much to us as lay people, but I can tell you from the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, these sets of kind of directions from the FDA about what they are expecting are really important documents. And these are just two that have come out in recent years that really emphasize the importance of thinking about and understanding and collecting information and evidence from the patient point of view about new products as they are in the development stages. And the one on the left is from the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, and also the Center for Biologics, which we haven't talked too much about, is using to factor in patient preference information into the development of new devices. And the one on the right is from the Center for Drug Evaluation. And that one is an early stage of a guidance document that will be out in draft form later this year. Next slide. So the kind of the future state, if you remember this slide from earlier, where the regulator and the patient might agree on the facts about a particular benefit risk equation on a medicine, but disagree on the values, what we're really kind of aiming for in this whole set of activities is a future state where, and then if you'll hit the, I think, forward button 2 times, we have a situation where we've got agreement on the facts and at least an understanding about the values. It may always be that there is a delta between, you know, what an individual patient might agree to accept in terms of a benefit risk ratio, but that at least the regulator will understand those values and inform their decisions accordingly. Next slide, please. Now, we mentioned the survey, and I have to admit I spend a little time each night before I go to bed, which probably doesn't help my sleep patterns, looking at the responses that have come in that day, and it's just been really fascinating. So we thought we would just share some of the interim results in a way that hopefully doesn't bias anybody who might fill it out after the webinar. But here are some of the things that we've heard. Next slide, please. So in the first several hundred responses, it's been really interesting based on kind of, you know, my understanding and spending a lot of time talking with Adam about this, that so many people have been successful in getting diagnosed within the first 12 months of recognizing symptoms. And many people who've so far taken the survey have been patients for quite a while. And so I think that's a good sign, although we've kind of gone back and forth on this about the term recognizing symptoms. As Adam said at the outset, you might not realize you have a problem until somebody else brings it to your attention, and perhaps that's been years after the issue with sleep apnea has started, particularly as have come up in the comments on this question. A lot of concern from people who are single about the kind of delayed recognition of particular, you know, the symptoms that arise during sleep, the loud snoring and the gasping and, you know, awaking and the sound of suffocation during the night, that not having a bed partner may delay that for some people. Adam, anything else you want to say about this particular?
No, I would just like to say, you know, it's the waking and the arousals that's what keeps us awake and alive. It's when we don't awake and arouse is when the real problems start.
Yeah. And those people would have a hard time filling out their survey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sean, next slide. So this was a question about the challenges that people have adhering to or sticking with their treatment, and that could be, we didn't define it as one thing or another, but you can see that the things that were most challenging are terms like uncomfortable, inconvenient, finances, and there were a lot of comments in the open text space about insurance, not having the funds for the supplies or the additional equipment that is required, the maintenance of the machines not being covered, those kinds of things. And lots of access, also comments about access and getting to knowledgeable sleep doctors, having to wait a long time to get an overnight sleep study, and then the barriers that insurance may not cover it. Insurance may not cover medications that could be helpful because they aren't specifically indicated for use in sleep apnea. So those are just some of the themes that came across in the comments so far. Adam, anything you want to add?
No, I would just, like to point out to everybody, from the layman's perspective, that it's, we're as apnea patients, we're taking a lot of different drugs, whether it's for our allergies or our asthma or our GERD or our reflux or any mental health issues. And there's, benefits and risks to every one of those as far as improving our apnea outcomes and our treatment of our apnea. So it's not a one size fits all. This is really, what is the best treatment for me? That so-called proverbial N of 1 is what we'd like to get to, is our long-term dream.
Yeah. Another question on the survey, toward the end of the survey, is about assuming no complete cure, trying to get at what would be the most important result that a new treatment could provide you. And you see kind of a spread of answers, but the most people just want to feel better and go about their daily life with fewer symptoms and burdens of treatment. And, we heard a lot in some other questions about the concerns, not just of the symptoms of the condition, but the overall potential for negative health consequences, particularly cardiovascular risks that are quite prevalent in sleep apnea being a concern.
And there are a lot of obstructions along that way, whether it's the adherence rules, or this is literally the only type of therapy, if you're on PAP therapy, that's taken away from you if you don't use it enough, unlike diabetes or hypertension patients. So there is a plethora of obstacles and obstructions for sleep apnea patients along the path up to diagnosis, through diagnosis, and all the way through treatment. And it's really, for me, I could tell you it was about finding the right set of variables to put together to help improve my quality of life, so where I could turn around and not only put my mask on, but then help my daughter, and then start to help the general public at large. And that's really, sort of what we're looking to get, that whole story that's been missing, and not just one specific treatment, not one specific pathway, but sort of a more holistic overall perspective of our journeys. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the other thing that your comments remind me of, Adam, is, this meeting is a partnership with the FDA, and it has really impressed me over the last 6 years of being involved with them on a series of these meetings that, they didn't really fully appreciate, because they were so used to looking at one product at a time as a new, medicine came before them, and they had to evaluate the evidence for that particular drug or device, that they really hadn't kind of factored in all of the things that a patient might use to try to reduce their symptoms, live better with their illness, and how those kind of different things might compete in their lives for the resources that they have, and the burdens of being, you know, a patient in terms of complying with the doctor's orders and, you know, getting insurance coverage and having to fight the payer to keep access to something, you know, that's helpful, but may not be directly, you know, indicated for their condition. So I think they've become much more aware and sensitive to the fact that it's really tricky, you know, to find kind of a patchwork of things that are working, and to navigate the healthcare system, and to navigate access and payment for all of those things, and continue to live your life as a person who's impacted by, you know, in most cases, a serious chronic condition. So I think all of these meetings have really brought that home to them, and they become really, I think, good students of hearing things from the patient perspective and gaining that appreciation. These are just some of the comments that came in open space. Toward the end of the survey, we ask, or at the very end of the survey, we ask, is there anything else you'd like us to know about your experience? And really, really revealing, compelling answers to this question, and just kind of try to capture a few of them here that run the gamut of, you know, what we've heard so far from people. And we want to make sure we hear from everybody who's taken time today through the survey as well. So be sure to follow that link that you've got in your chat box.
I'm talking into mute. I was just going to say, you know, back to your example that you were talking about with, you know, with the different divisions of the FDA and looking at all these things and how they interact with each other. You know, the classic example for me in my use case is that, you know, with a mental health component of anxiety, if I would have walked through a certain doctor's door, you know, I would have most likely been given a prescription for a pill that probably had a muscle relaxing component in it, and that pill probably most likely, and we know that according to the science, would make my sleep apnea worse because it would be relaxing the airways in my throat and in my airway. Whereas, you know, if the doctors, if the healthcare providers, or whoever on your team are educated and up to speed along your healthcare journey, they would understand that yes, you need a potentially a pharmaceutical device for your anxiety, but you need one that's going to work with your apnea therapy, whatever it is, whether it's oral appliance or CPAP therapy, or if you're doing oral myofunctional therapy, or if you're just doing positional therapy and sleeping on you know, your left shoulder. There's a lot of things that we can be doing as a society to improve not how much we sleep or how long we sleep, but the real issue for us is what kind of sleep. And helping people understand what their baseline really is with good sleep is, I think, hopefully an outcome out of this meeting that will open up not only a lot of eyes, but start to provoke and have some really good constructive conversations to finding better solutions to our patients and removing these proverbial obstructions along the path.
Great. Okay. I think there's another slide after this one.
Hey, what do you know?
Yeah, ways you can help. So again, we'll pitch the survey and participating in that. Registering to participate in the June 8th meeting, and that can be in person here in the Washington, D.C. area where I live, or by live webcast. And I believe it will be available on Facebook Live as well. Is that right, Adam?
It will be on Facebook Live off of the ASA Facebook page, and it will also be on our YouTube channel, archived and broadcast for later. I think I was told that we're having some issues with streaming this to Facebook today, so we'll put up a recording of it immediately when this is done, so that people on our page and on our groups can see that as well on other social media channels.
Great. And then the third way you can help is to share information about the Awake Sleep Apnea Initiative. You should be able to go to ASAA's Facebook and Twitter profiles and just kind of click on share or retweet links to the survey and the media. And meeting, using your own social media channels, and we find that can be really helpful. People tend to act on things their friends and family ask them to do, and this is something that probably all of us know somebody who's dealing with sleep apnea, and we may not be aware of it, but if they see it in our feeds, they might take action on their own behalf. So please do that as well.
Yeah, I can't reiterate that enough, Kim. It's really, you know, this is a syndrome that a lot of people walk through a lot of different doors before they're ever dealt with or figured out that this is a part of their issues in their life, not the root issue, like some like to believe that we think it is. And with that being said, it's so important that the ones of us that have made it out on the other side to look back in hindsight and figure out what went right, what went wrong, and what we're doing, that we aren't just the martyrs, but we are the mentors, and we lead the next generation who are going to be dealing with this, whether it's the dementia and the generation of dementia families, or the cancer families, or the diabetes families, or the heart disease, or the mental health. And literally, this is, you know, sleep apnea is a cradle to grave issue. It's whether it's pregnant women who are hypoxic in their third trimester, all the way to a young child developing, and, you know, sudden infant death syndrome. And, you know, there's a thought that really the sudden infant death syndrome, the only difference between that and sleep apnea is that a one-year-old baby can roll over and catch its breath. So it's you know, we as parents, we're all on heightened alertness when we have our children, and then we sort of the guardrails go down. But that's really, for me and my family, that's when, you know, as I figured out my issues and I looked at my then daughter at 2 years old, and I was diagnosed when she was about 6 months old. So it took me about a year and a half to really realize that she was having the same issues that I was. But the beauty of it was, is since I was now educated and observant and aware and thinking clearly, I could then treat her and theoretically prevent 35 years of incremental decline that I had faced, and that my father before me and his father before him had faced, since this is one of those diseases that seems to run in families, especially if you look alike and you have the same anatomical features. So that's my my stump stool speech for the day, Kim.
Great. Let's thank some people. I think there's another slide.
Yeah, there's actually a question in here as well, too, in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah.
So, Sean, if you want to move the slide, I can get to the question. Maya asks, great webinar and amazing work with the survey. I know that no discussion is made of neurostimulation as a therapy OSA. Is there a reason for that? It's totally just an oversight. We plan on having all patients represented from all different walks of life and all different interventions. So whether it's the upper glossal nerve wave stimulator, whether it's myofunctional therapy, whether it's combination therapy with an oral appliance and CPAP mask, whether it's surgical interventions. You know, we have a lot of MMA patients that they couldn't take any of this, and they literally went and had their maxilla broken and expanded to increase the size of their airway. There's children with tonsils and adenoid surgeries. There's allergy surgery going on. So there's a lot of different interventions that we want to discuss, and we want to make sure that are represented, so that those stories are told at this meeting. That's why we don't just want one type of patient at this meeting. We want the whole gamut represented. So we call on all stakeholders and players in the sleep field. Now's the time to help us get these surveys completed, so that we have the patients that aren't getting the help, the patients that are doing well, the patients that are in the gray area represented, so we can really start to educate our regulators about what's in our patients' best interest at the end of the day.
Right. And before we wrap up, just a thank you to some sponsors who have helped to provide funding to defray costs of this meeting and all the initiatives that support it. They have provided unrestricted education grants and are not involved in any way in the decision-making around this initiative, but obviously instrumental to helping us put it on. And then we also have a number of partners for the campaign. listed on the next slide.
We lose you, Sean?
There we go.
Thank you.
And you can see that we've taken a really broad.
Go ahead, Kim. I'm sorry.
We've taken a pretty broad approach and tried to bring in some of the conditions that are very prevalent among people with sleep apnea and for whom sleep apnea is a confounding condition in the treatment of these primary diseases. Say more about it, Adam.
So as you can see, there's a mental health component. The sleep techs who actually touch a lot of our patients in the labs and in the clinics are there. A patient co-op is there. Our partner, the COPD Foundation, which is a patient-led foundation who we've learned a lot from, is there. Project Sleep, which is Julie Flygar in the narcolepsy community. We have the Medical Device Innovation Consortium there. The good folks at Stop AFib, we're part of the Healthy Heart Alliance, and a lot of the Paralyzed Veterans of America who are on CPAP machine. And then you'll see in the right-hand corner, we also have the Academy of Orofacial Myofunctional Therapy, which is, once we change the bones in the airway, we also have to retrain ourselves how to breathe with our nose. And then you have autoimmune issues like celiac disease. So if you have inflammation from your food, that's also going to impair your airway. And we don't know if one's the chicken or the egg, but these are the type of research we want to start looking at so that we can start to get some definitive answers for our community. Because everyone sleeps and everyone has a sleep component, whether it's sleep apnea or sleep disorder breathing or just poor sleep hygiene. These are all playing factors in our lives, whether we know it consciously or unconsciously. And we invite many more partners who we're still waiting to hear from to join their name on here, because I think it's an important statement to the regulators and to the public at large, how many different people are dealing with this issue. It's not, I just have sleep apnea. I might have apnea and COPD, I might have apnea and diabetes, I might have apnea and AFib, I might have apnea and mental health and anxiety issues and depression issues. You name it, we've seen people in our cohort that are dealing with it. So it's important to get all these stories out in the open at one single point in time.
Great. And then the last slide is just a reminder again to visit the website, register for the meeting, take the survey. Actually, next slide, Sean.
Hey.
Go. And you can find all of that at awakesleepapnea.org.
Right. Which there are two links to. One is to register now for the meeting, whether in person or via the live broadcast. And then right below that is also another link directly to our survey for this meeting that we urge you all to take and to share amongst family, friends, and your patients and or communities. And with that, we'd like to thank you very much. I'd like to thank Kim for putting up with me and my ADD and helping us educate our community and others that don't know about this initiative and its importance. And we invite anybody who has any questions to please go in the chat box, the Q&A, or in the chat box and ask us. We will be posting this up on our Facebook page after the meeting's over, so there'll be a replay for anybody who wasn't able to watch this live.
Great. Thanks again to everybody for taking part this afternoon, and thanks, Adam, for your leadership on this initiative.
Thank you, Kim. I couldn't have done it without you. Have a good day, all, and get some good sleep. We'll see you in June.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Sean.